Cool. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and just give a really brief introduction to our Peatlands project. Can everybody see my screen?
Looks good.
Okay,
Yes.
wonderful. Um, so, since I started taking over for the forest bird project and working in the avian ecology lab, we've been concerned about forested peatlands. I'm also very concerned about black ash wetlands, which I'll talk about at the end of the day. But basically, I think the very first year, so 2016-ish, we started working with peatlands in a little bit more in depth based on the information that we were getting from the National Forest Bird Monitoring Program, that these species were something we should be paying attention to. So one of the things that you guys all know, that the biodiversity is so high, especially in the forests, and Minnesota is a really special place because we have so much biodiversity. So this is from the Minnesota Biological Survey, and man, we all are associated with some beautiful lands that have a lot of wonderful things that we can go out and see and ways to experience nature. But also we know that they're threatened, right? We know all about climate change. We know all about how sort of these temperatures of changing. There's, obviously snow, the most snow that we've had all season right now. But increases in temperature, changes in precipitation, changes in extreme weather events, all of that is very important, and things that we need to recognize really moving forward and being more vigilant about it as we're thinking about wildlife and biodiversity conservation. And then also, of course, in our forests, we've already mentioned that we have emerald ash borer. And in the lowland systems, we have the eastern larch beetle, which has, again, as you guys know, been in its 25th consecutive year of outbreak in the state, and so much of our tamarack has been impacted. So what does that all mean for biodiversity? Well, I think conceptually at this really large scale, we know that we need to think about climate change and biodiversity and climate change, because they're really interrelated. And if we start losing biodiversity, it can accelerate the destabilization of different ecosystem processes. And unfortunately, I think that the world has been sending us a pretty big signal recently that, we're in a state of change, and we are seeing a lot of population declines. While we haven't gotten to the point where a lot of species, especially in this area, are endangered or going extinct yet, I think that's something that we need to keep in mind, especially in terms of local movements, our local extinction out of our states or out of our forest in general. Of course, in North America, there was this paper that came out in 2019 that showed that over 1.2 billion birds have been lost since 1970s, when we started really monitoring these things. And it's unfortunate because, of course, Jerry Nemi was great when he started this program, because he knew that some of this stuff was happening in Minnesota, and that's why we started the National Forest Monitoring Program. But since then, I think we've been watching it decline, and we're in a point in the world when we need to do a lot more of the sort of actions, or figuring out what we can do to help eliminate some of these declines, or stabilize the declines, or actually do the conservation work. So I say that it's time to shift from this sort of stewardship, kind of watching or monitoring populations, to more of that conservation framework. And, unfortunately, and a lot of times we talk about forest management, we're talking about the economic benefits of forest management instead of the biodiversity benefits of forest management. And so thinking about bringing that conservation mind to the forefront is something that I talk a lot about when I talk with partners or private landowners, you guys. Of course, it's important to always balance the economics depending on what kind of landowners we're talking about. But really, in general, the focus on biodiversity, I think, needs elevated at this point in our world, and in our state. So when we talk about ecosystem functioning and why we need to sort of system functioning, it sort of gets very nebulous. Oh, my internet connection is unstable. I'm just gonna shut off my video here, and hopefully that works. Okay. So when we start talking about ecosystem functioning, it's hard to really define. And so what we want to think about, oh, this little cutie. So what we like to think about when we're talking about really getting that ecosystem functioning down or quantifying it in some sort of meaningful way is using this holistic approach, which we've been doing with both our peatlands and black ash projects, and being really realistic and identifying the trade-offs between those different management priorities, whether it's managing for the economic benefits, managing for biodiversity, managing for clean water, for example. All of those things need to be considered. Um, from the wildlife side of things, the way that we sort of think about it in the lab is, one, we want to look at the indicator for ecosystem function as overall biodiversity. How well are our forested systems really affecting and conserving biodiversity? But then also there's these areas or cover types or habitat types or whatever that maybe don't have a lot of biodiversity compared to other areas, but they are really unique habitats and support rare or endangered species or species with declining populations. So one of those areas is these forested peatlands or lowland conifer, as we sometimes call it too. We sort of use those terms interchangeably. The Peatlands team is a team of researchers that we've been working with for 5, 6 years now. The PI is Marcella Windmiller Campione, and she's a silviculturist down at the Twin Cities campus. Rob Slezak, who's currently with the USDA Forest Service out in the Pacific Northwest, but he's in charge of the hydrology stuff. And then, of course, all my lab. And we've had great partnerships with the Minnesota DNR up in the Red Lake Peatlands area that have been incredibly supportive and helpful as we sort of try and get some of this peatland work out onto the ground in real life that Steve will talk to you about in his presentation. But again, I might probably preaching to the choir, but in Minnesota, there's over 6 million acres of forested wetlands. And, you know, there's a lot of them and it holds a lot of carbon. So again, really important for overall climate change mitigation, adaptation, resilience, all of those things very important. Again, we know all about eastern larch beetle, and we want to really think about how is this affecting biodiversity. Also, when it comes to harvest, we think that all is obviously having a pretty big impact on biodiversity as well. And if we even just think about how we manage a lot of our black spruce forests or even tamarack forests, it's been the same for a very long time. And of course, with all these climate change, the forest pests, maybe it's time to reconsider or change some of our management approaches. And so what we wanted to do when we first started our first iteration of the Peatlands project is to take this holistic kind of understanding and figure out what was going on with the peatlands and basically how does forest management affect all of these different sort of pieces of the puzzle. So we set up this study design. It's basically a retrospective design of time since disturbance for the 3 natural plant communities that are found in Minnesota: the stagnant spruce, productive spruce, and tamarack. And then we kind of binned time since management into these 4 different age classes. Turns out that people don't pay a lot of attention to the age classes of lowland conifer. So there's some variation to those overall bins, but for the most part, it's sort of young, teenage, middle-aged, old is the way that our stands come out. And they're distributed, you know, sort of north to south across Minnesota. So the first piece of the puzzle is we were looking at hydrology, and there's a paper that came out in 2023 in the Journal of Environmental Management that kind of summarizes a lot of the hydrological data. If you or anybody in the forest might be interested in it. But basically, the take-home points are that there's limited lasting impact of forest harvesting on water table dynamics, and that's pretty unique. There are clear effects of precipitation and drought on water table dynamics, and so you know, those big changes in the precipitation events that have been happening over time might have a big influence on overall like tree regeneration, tree survival, that sort of thing. It's a pretty broad look at the hydrology in these stands, and so we're trying better like sort of fine-tuned assessment of what might be going on in each of these stands in terms of hydrology. It seems that tamarack was more responsive to changes in precipitation. Again, thinking about how is susceptible is it going to be in a changing climate in the future. But overall, we found out that we need more data or more longer term data because, as you guys know, each year is so different in the past few years that it's hard to, there's so much variability. We need to really sort of hone in on some of that data. Marcella and her team are looking at the vegetation. And basically what they've found is that the understory vegetation communities vary among cover types, and it also changes with time since harvest, which isn't too surprising. Peat depth and stand age are those biggest sort of impact factors for what contributes to overall vegetation biodiversity. And then again, this isn't surprising or groundbreaking, but stand development and regeneration after harvesting is pretty slow in all lowland hardwood forests, but especially in those stagnant stands. Um, you know, again, if we're out in these forests and we kind of know how wonderful and majestic they are, those really old lowland conifer stands, both the productive and the stagnant, have such unique structural characteristics, and it contributes to the vegetation biodiversity. When it comes to looking at tree regeneration, so far, Marcella and her team have found like the big sort of take home point that they're celebrating is that it's a natural state to have multi-age stands in both black spruce and tamarack forests. And so there's a ability to have advanced regeneration, and it's probably a really important thing to stand dynamics, which it seems to be not as commonly known as maybe we think it would be, considering, you know, we do a lot of clear cutting and then seeding, but they are multi-aged stands and we're sort of seeing regeneration coming up in these small pockets. So also stands may be only entering the understory reinitiation phase after about 100 years. So we're really talking about a long time, and the effects of management are being sustained in these systems for a very, very long time. So we're wildlife people. So how does it impact wildlife? Well, I'll just give you a peek into our overall bird community assessments. We did breeding bird point counts similar to what we do in the National Forest Monitoring Program in all of these 48 stands. And essentially, there's a lot of different birds that use them, especially those younger age stands. You know, it's not necessarily a unique community, but there are 13 passerine species that are forested peatland habitat specialists that breed in Minnesota, and all of them rely on mature forest conditions. And so those mature forested peatlands are really biodiversity hotspots. And so you can see how much the species diversity increases really after we get to that, you know, what I would say 50 to 60 age class or time since disturbance. And if we're thinking about the rotation for a lot of, especially black spruce, happens, you know, as early as 60 years, we're not even giving the chance for lowland conifers to really get to that stage where they're supporting that unique diversity, both in terms of vegetation and bird communities. So, you know, one of the things when we put our hydrology, vegetation, and bird community things together is that, gosh, those mature forested peatlands are really, really important. And there might be issues with hydrology and regeneration that we're facing now that they haven't faced in the past. So thinking about how to keep those mature forested peatlands on the landscape and make that a higher priority, again, sort of viewing it through the lens of that biodiversity instead of the economic benefits, is something that we feel is really important. And so some of these take-home points that Kara and Steve will reiterate are to think about those stands, conserving them. They may provide climate refugia for a lot of different species, both during the summer and in the winter. You know, the national forests do have the landscape management plans, other agencies don't. And so fragmentation is going to be really important, again, as Kara and Steve will tell you about. And one of the things that we think is really important is if you have to harvest black spruce, think about not clear cutting and develop those alternatives, because that is taking off really valuable habitat off the landscape and also creating that fragmentation, which is decreasing the quality of mature forest that's around those areas as well. And so that's sort of the preview, I guess, of our peatlands projects. Kara, do you want to go ahead? I'll stop sharing and you can go ahead and take over. And Kara's going to talk about boreal chickadees and some of her work, that really cool work that she did as part of her master's project. And she just graduated in August, and we tricked her into sticking around and working in the lab.
No, okay. Hold on, let me start sharing mine then. wait, there we go. And then I'll do that. And then which one is everybody seeing? The one, like the presenter mode or the notes mode?
Yep, your presenter mode.
Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, and I might actually just turn my camera off too, because I was having some internet issues. Hold on, let me see if I can, or maybe it'll be fine. Okay, yeah, so as Alexis said, I did my master's research on boreal chickadees, specifically looking at their breeding in the Red Lake Wildlife Management Area. Just a quick introduction. We've talked about these little guys a few times today, but boreal chickadees are related to the common black-cap chickadee that we see a lot through Minnesota. They live pretty much exclusively in the northern boreal coniferous forests. And in Minnesota, they're like really closely associated with those, the lowland conifers that we've been kind of talking about a bit today. They are a forest interior and an area sensitive species. So they require like large areas of habitat, and they prefer to live in like the center or the core area of the forest as opposed to like on the edges. In Minnesota, they are at the southern edge of their range. We've been kind of also talking about bird species at the southern edge of the range today. And they are cavity nesters. So they are, lowland conifer specialists and cavity nesters, so they kind of fill in those two boxes of species that we're a little bit more concerned about right here in Minnesota. They are secondary cavity nesters, so they don't make their own nests readily, but they'll use like old woodpecker holes or like other natural cavities. There's one right there. They'll also readily use nest boxes, which is great if you want to study their breeding ecology. So in Minnesota, they are, as mentioned, listed as a species in greatest conservation need, with their declines attributed to habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation. Results from the breeding bird monitoring surveys that Josh talked about earlier indicate a negative trend. So we are seeing some declines in this species in Minnesota. And that is in line with like regional trends. So the North American Breeding Bird Survey is also showing declines for this species. And then the right picture there are eBird trends, which are also showing declines. So this species is one to be keeping our eyes on. And that kind of summarizes the status of this bird, but they're actually a pretty understudied bird, and one reason is that they're kind of hard to find. So they occur in pretty low densities. They live in hard to reach places like peatlands. They also don't have like a broadcast song. So as Josh was talking about those point count surveys, we're listening for birds, but boreal chickadees don't have like a song that they repeat often, so it can be missed on point counts or other kinds of surveys. So we just like don't really know a lot about this species. The main research on their breeding biology comes from one paper in the 1970s. So there's just not a lot known about their nesting ecology. But we know that habitat loss and fragmentation are likely the main drivers of declines for this species, but we wanted to look at like specifically how those factors are affecting populations in Minnesota, specifically how they're affecting breeding boreal chickadees, because if we can identify where, how, and why we're losing birds in a populations, that can help us to potentially mitigate further declines, and anything that we can do to increase breeding helps us to bolster populations. So just a quick note about fragmentation. We all are probably really familiar with this, but fragmentation is the breaking up, right, of large contiguous areas of habitat into smaller areas. So that not only removes habitat from the landscape, but it also reduces the core area, which I was mentioning earlier, that boreal chickadees kind of prefer the core area, and it also increases edges. And that's important because a lot of studies have shown that edge has negative effects on breeding birds, forest birds, particularly because it might increase predation and nest parasitism. So how do we measure habitat quality? It's not quite as straightforward as it might seem. There are different ways to go about this. So in older studies, people would look at things like the distribution or density of an organism and try to like infer habitat quality, but that can be misleading. So there are kind of other ways that ecologists will try to measure habitat quality today. So you can measure habitat attributes directly. So looking at critical resources like nesting sites or food abundance. And you could also look at the opposite, ecological constraints like predation or competition. Or you can actually measure the organism directly to show habitat quality. So that means like looking at demographic measures like reproduction, survival, recruitment, or individual condition like body condition or physiological condition. And that's important because habitat quality actually impacts on the individual level, which is then carried over into the population. So ideally, a study, if you're looking to measure habitat quality, you kind of like measure a number of these attributes and then try to determine if there's an association with these attributes to like vegetation or landscape features, things that you can actually manage for, because that's the only way that we can like make an impact and have success in bolstering populations. So a little bit about this study. We conducted this research in the Red Lake Wildlife Management Area, which is in northern Minnesota. It's the largest WMA in the state, and it has over 86,000 hectares, much of which consists of that lowland conifer, specifically black spruce peatland forest. And in the WMA, these forests are actively logged and typically using that clear cutting method, which creates fragmentation on the landscape. So we wanted to see how fragmentation was impacting breeding. And to do this, we put up a whole bunch of nest boxes in black spruce stands throughout the WMA. And the patches that we chose, they varied in their size and the degree of fragmentation within the landscape. I specifically wanted to look at provisioning rates, body condition, and growth rates for my study. And I chose these because they can all be indicators of habitat quality. So provisioning rates can tell us something about food availability or quality in the site. And then the same goes for growth rates and body conditions of the nestlings before they leave the nest. So some of the specific questions I wanted to know were, do these measures, do they vary by fragmentation or food availability? And do fragmentation or habitat qualities impact food availability for breeding boreal chickadees? We assessed food availability by conducting arthropod surveys. We used the branch clipping method, which there's a picture of here. So I would go and put a bag around a branch, and my coworker Steve Colby would use a very large pruning device to clip the branches. And we chose that method because boreal chickadees will forage off of like the mid to outer part of the branch. So we thought that it'd be like a good way to assess food availability for the species. And then for provisioning observations, as I said earlier, they can be used as a proxy for habitat quality. So if you think about it, if you are a bird and you're going out to provide food for your nestlings, if you go out and food is readily available, you can make more trips in and out. You can find food quicker, come back quicker. So that might be an indicator that you're in a high quality habitat because there's more food availability. But on the other hand, Actually, as I was in the middle of my graduate research, a paper from Canada came out that showed specifically that boreal chickadees will actually increase provisioning rates to kind of compensate for low quality prey items. So that kind of confused things a little bit for this part of the study, but I'll talk about that later. So we recorded provisioning rates and counted the number of times that chickadees came to feed their nestlings. And we used this as a variable to assess our habitat quality within our sites. And I actually have a little bit of footage of the nest boxes, which is just kind of neat because we all like to watch little videos here and there. So this is a typical provisioning observation of a nest box. So you can see a parrot comes in with food items, so that would be counted as a provisioning. This is that same box a little bit later. And this is interesting. This is one of our banded individuals. So this was an individual that we banded as a nestling from a box the year before and then came back to nest again. Also from my provisioning observations, I got a good glimpse of typical nest predators. So red squirrels were common, the most common nest predator for boreal chickadees. For this nest, the parents did eventually harass the squirrel away. And this is just a really neat thing that I recorded. This is a pine martin coming in to check out a nest box. And this dude also did give up eventually. It's just kind of like a neat little recording, a little glimpse of the bog and the wildlife within it. Cool. Just a little detour here. All right, as I mentioned earlier, I also looked at nestling growth rates and body conditions. To obtain these metrics, I weighed and measured nestlings 3 times during the nestling period, and then I created a body condition index using these measurements and then calculated growth rates for nestlings. And going back to thinking about habitat quality, I was trying to determine if there were fragmentation or forest characteristics that would influence faster growth rates or different body conditions with the chicks to help indicate what is quality habitat for this species. To characterize the vegetation qualities within the stands, we conducted vegetation surveys. So we conducted 20 systematic vegetation surveys within each of our study sites. So we looked at average canopy density, total tree count, canopy composition, and average tree height. And then I also calculated landscape metrics by classifying cover types in ArcGIS and using the landscape metrics package in R. So I'll get briefly into the results for the arthropod surveys. The most abundant orders in 2021 were Arania, so spiders, and Diptera, so like fly-like things. And then in 2022, again, Arania, and then Hemiptera are true bugs. And so I use generalized linear mixed models to analyze provisioning rates and nestling growth rates. In relation to those fragmentation metrics and other habitat characteristics. And I found that earlier provisioning rates were correlated with the distance of the nest site to the edge of the forest patch. So actually, the further that a nest box was from the edge, the lower the provisioning rates were. And I found that nestling growth rates were positively influenced by the percentage of black spruce forest cover type on both the nest site scale and the landscape scale. So growth rates were higher if the nest was located in an area where there was more black spruce forest around it. And I used the same modeling approach to analyze body condition. And I found that pre-fledged body condition was correlated with arthropod diversity within the site. So nestlings that were reared in stands that had higher arthropod diversity based on those surveys had a higher pre-fledged body condition. So then I wanted to look at, okay, well then what's influencing arthropod diversity within our stands? And I found that diversity was correlated again with the amount of black spruce cover type in the landscape and also the heterogeneity of tree density within the stand. So if there was more variability of tree density within the stand. I also looked at boreal chickadee nest success. So we monitored 35 boreal chickadee nests between 2020 and 2022. Out of those 35, 10 of those nests failed. 8 were depredated and 2 were abandoned. And we modeled nest survival using a binomial response approach. And we found that the top performing models that best explained nest survival were the age of nest. So as a nest gets older, as it progresses from the egg stage to the nestling stage, it has a higher chance of failing. And that makes sense. Then that's seen in lots of other bird species. So as eggs hatch and there are nestlings, parents are coming more frequently in and out of the nest box for vision. That can draw attention to predators. And then we also found that on the nest site scale, again, there's kind of a theme here. The amount of black spruce forest around the nesting location was associated with higher nest survival. So kind of putting this all together, what can this mean about habitat quality for boreal chickadees? So nestling growth rates were associated with the amount of black spruce forest in the landscape. And those nestlings that are reared in stands that had higher arthropod diversity had a better pre-fledged body condition. And arthropod diversity was correlated with the amount of black spruce forest in the landscape and the variability of the stand structure. And also that boreal chickadee breeding success is higher when nestling locations are surrounded by greater amounts of black spruce forest. So we're kind of seeing a theme here that black spruce is really important for this species. And then lastly, I wanted to look at what nestlings were eating and being fed by their parents. And understanding diet is pretty crucial for having kind of like the full picture of the ecology of a species. And it can also be useful for conservation, particularly if you want to manage habitat for food availability. So some of the specific questions that I was asking for this part of my study were, one, just what are nestlings eating? And then are boreal chickadee parents selecting certain prey items to feed their young? And then are there differences in nestling diets between the study sites or between the years of this study? To do this, I used DNA metabar coding. So you might wonder, like, how can you use DNA to determine diet? Well, you can figure that out through poop. So as we eat, the DNA of the food that we're eating is conserved as it goes through our digestive tract. So you can take fecal samples, extract DNA, and using PCR, you can determine what DNA was present in the feces. So I did this. I took fecal samples from nestlings 3 times during the nestling stage. And I found 10 different orders of arthropods in fecal samples and 123 unique species. So top frequently occurring arthropod orders detected in fecal samples I found were Diptera, Lepidoptera, Arania, and Hemiptera. And then also we found beetles, mayflies, and caddisflies in over 20% of the fecal samples. Between the two study years, we found that Araenia was higher in 2022 than in 2021, and also that Trichoptera was higher in 2022 than in 2021. And this is an interesting fact that we kind of dug a little bit deeper into after I submitted my thesis. But Trichoptera were found in pretty few samples in 2021. And I don't know if you, I mean, of course, we all remember 2021 was that really bad drought year. And, you know, caddisflies, Trichoptera, which are caddisflies, rely and require water for their larval stage. So we were kind of wondering and thinking that possibly the drought was affecting Trichoptera populations, and other research has found that drought does heavily affect Trichoptera. And you can see that caddisflies were found in, you know, a quarter of the samples in 2022, which suggests that they're a pretty significant or important prey item for boreal chickadees. So that that kind of makes us wonder how drought might be affecting boreal chickadees and other insect-eating bird species in the peatlands in the future. Boreal chickadees we found were potentially selecting Diptera and Lepidoptera, as they occurred more frequently in fecal samples than they did in arthropod surveys. Quick note about the bias of our sampling method, though. Branch clipping is really great for sampling sessile or, like, you know, less moving arthropod species like caterpillars, but it's not the best at capturing flying insects like Diptera. So it's possible that that the difference between the fecal samples and the arthropod surveys for the Diptera was just due to the bias of the method, but probably that's not the case for Lepidoptera, and that makes sense. Lots of passerines will actively select for caterpillars when feeding their young because of the high fat and protein content. So kind of back to that initial question for my research, is fragmentation impacting the quality of habitat for breeding boreal chickadees in Minnesota? What do all the results from this study say? So growth rates positively influenced by more black spruce around the nesting site. Body condition was correlated with arthropod diversity. Arthropod diversity, again, positively associated with black spruce forest in the landscape. So together, these findings suggest that larger structurally complex black spruce forests are quality habitat for breeding boreal chickadees, as they provide an access to more diverse prey, which results in nestlings with a higher growth rate and better pre-fledged body condition. And we also found that the top model explaining nest survival showed an increase in survival when there's an increase in black spruce forest around the nest site. And we found that the age of the nest was also an indicator of nest survival. Predation was the main cause of nest failure. And when you take the age of the nests in account, that might be because nests are more conspicuous to predators as they begin provisioning their nestlings. And in my research for this, I found that lots of other studies have shown that nest predators in the boreal forest specifically are more abundant in fragmented patches. So it's possible that fragmentation might be impacting nest survival for boreal chickadees by increasing predator abundance. And provisioning rates were higher for nests located closer to the forest edge. As I mentioned earlier, provisioning rates can be used as an indicator of food availability. So more food, higher provisioning rates. However, as I mentioned, there was that recent study that showed that boreal chickadees will actually increase provisioning efforts to compensate for low prey quality. And I didn't find a correlation between nestling body condition and the distance to edge. So while it's possible that boreal chickadees in our study sites were benefiting from breeding closer to the edge, it could also be that prey items taken in that near edge habitat are not really high quality. And so they're increasing the provisioning efforts to compensate for that. So we don't have like a really clear answer on that, but it's just something interesting, and actually studies that look at, you know, like what prey is available on edges versus in the interior of a boreal forest would be really useful in trying to kind of like suss this out. Boreal chickadees rely heavily on prey items from Lepidoptera, Arania, and Diptera, and they're likely actively selecting for Lepidoptera. When you look at the results of the pre-fledged body condition analysis and the diversity of the food items that they're eating, it does appear that access to a diverse suite of prey items is really important for provisioning parents. So, you know, we're interested in management implications in our lab. Really driving this home. Large tracts of black spruce forests are important for breeding boreal chickadees, right? Looking at their nestling growth rates. As Alexis mentioned earlier, clear cutting is the kind of like the main practice for logging for black spruce. And we suggest that if a stand is to be logged, you know, black spruce is has high commercial value, so we can't act like it's not going to be harvested at all. Alternative methods like strip cutting, selection cutting, shelterwood cutting might be a more favorable option. And any harvest method that reduces fragmentation will probably help mitigate further declines of the species and increase nest success. Also, having an insight to what arthropods are being consumed by birds can be advantageous for creating management plans. So many arthropods are reliant on only a few host species. So if you know what birds are eating, that can help a conservationist know what plant species to manage for within the landscape. And arthropod diversity has been positively associated with canopy complexity. So again, practices like clear cutting that lower stand complexity are probably detrimental to food availability for forest dwelling birds. I think I did it in a reasonable amount of time. But these are all the people who have helped on this project, and I'll take any questions about this study. And now if anybody has any, and I think Steve is going to be following up on some of this research.
Awesome. Thanks, Kara. Any questions for Kara? All right, Steve, you want to talk about the next life stage of the boreal chickadee buddies and bring us home?
Sure.
I bet black spruce, mature black spruce is important.
Yeah. Yeah, so we'll be sort of singing the same tune, but we have a long way to go and a short time to get there, so we'll hit it. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about what happens to those boreal chickadees once they leave their nests. As Kara said, we have a lot of nest boxes up in the Red Lake WMA area. This was excellent so that we could not spend all of our time trying to find these shy little buggers out in the spruce, but just go to the boxes where we knew they were, and then open them and see what was or which were being used. So over the course of 2020 to 2022, we color banded a whole bunch of nestlings like the one you saw in Kara's video. We attached 57 transmitters to birds from 23 broods, and we followed them around from day 0, which is the day that they exit the cavity and enter the wide world, until we lost them. But usually we followed them for at least 30 days. Why do we do this? Well, simply put, the period of time right after a bird leaves its nest is the period of highest mortality. And so as a result, we want to know what those birds need, where they go, what they use, where they die, where they don't die, so that we can make sure in our various management plans, et cetera, that we are giving them exactly what they need during that time period so they don't all croak, because we're not going to increase populations if all of our young birds immediately die after they leave the nest. So we followed them around a lot during those years, and we collected in total 602 locations of the fledglings via handheld telemetry. So we were walking around all day and chasing them around, and we usually would get 1 point because they stick together as a brood, unlike a lot of species that the male and female split up the brood. Chickadees, boreal chickadees, all stick together, which is very cute and nice. So after we do that a lot, it's an awful lot of walking around in the bog, we can get a cool figure like this that shows basically as birds age, the distance they go from the previous day. And one thing that jumps out at you that's maybe not surprising is that, you know, as the birds get older, they can go farther because they're developing into fully functional adult birds at that point. But also, if you look right around day 19, you'll see the error bars surrounding those points go way up. And that's because about 19 or 20 days after they leave the nest, their parents boot them out of the territory, and these birds are then on their own. And so as a result, they no longer are being shepherded around to certain areas that the parents like or whatever, but they're going and just, you know, trying to find what's out there for them. And so you can see, you know, as they get older, they can go really far sometimes when they're looking for appropriate habitat. So this will come back into play in a little bit, but you know, this is another way of visualizing that. This is the largest distance we ever saw a boreal chickadee move at a certain age after it left the nest. And so you can see, you know, 250 meters or so, they can do that pretty quick right after they leave the nest. But then during that period when they're on their own, all of a sudden we saw birds going, you know, over 1.5 kilometers in a day while they're looking for habitat. And we have termed these periods the dependent period when they're with their parents and the independent period when they are not. And you can see those very different behaviors during those 2 time periods of a young boreal chickadee's life. We did a lot of vegetation surveys. So every time we got one of those 602 telemetry points, we did a vegetation survey there. Then we also did a vegetation survey 30 meters away in a random direction. And so it was basically comparing areas that they were using to areas that they could use, but they didn't necessarily. And we collected a lot of the same information that Kara described that she looked at throughout the stands and at the nest boxes. And we did a whole lot of modeling of this, and no surprise to any of you after hearing Kara say it a number of times, percent canopy cover of black spruce was very important for the young boreal chickadees in all ages together after they left the nest, but also both in the dependent period when they were with their parents and in the independent period when they were not. And then there was a limited support for black spruce count as being important as well in some of those models, but canopy cover of black spruce was very important in all of them. Okay, we also wanted to look at the sort of the landscape scale cover type selection and how these birds were viewing their landscape and what they were choosing to use and what they were avoiding. And so we used that figure that I talked about just a few slides ago, where we, you know, found the largest movement at any age of all of the chickadees combined. And then at each of those ages, around all of the points of that age, we put a buffer around those points, and the buffer got bigger as the age increased because they were able, or would have been able to explore any of those particular areas within that buffer. We had in the bottom left, you can see we digitized a large area around our study sites with the different cover types. And then we were able to calculate the percentage of those different cover types that was available to those birds. And then we compared that to what was what they were actually using. And this was a really fun and interesting procedure to undertake. It took a lot of time in GIS and stuff like that. But what was really exciting to see is that even in a landscape where you're like, oh, I don't know, they're just like using what's around or where, what's nearby from the previous day. And that isn't the case, even in an area that is somewhat heavily dominated by black spruce. They are using the black spruce in a higher proportion than what is available to them. And you can see that in that figure on the right there. The blue color is the percent of the habitat that they used, and the salmon pinkish color is the percent of the habitat that's available to them. So anytime that the bar on the left is larger than the bar on the right, or the blue bar is larger than the salmon bar, they're using that habitat at a higher frequency than is available to them. And then the inverse is true. And so you can see they're really keying in on both productive and stagnant black spruce. As you likely know, productive spruce is, larger trees, usually a little less wet. Stagnant spruce is very wet oftentimes and has smaller trees. Even if they're quite old, they can be relatively small. And you can see they're avoiding tamarack and brush and other things that were available to them and they could have used potentially. And we also looked at survival using our mark, and we looked at various things, including their age, the percent black spruce within 150 meters of the nest, the condition, like Kara was talking about in her previous talk. We looked at whether drought year or normal year was important. And we also were interested in if the number of brood mates was going to have an effect on survival. And unsurprisingly, once again, the thing that popped out as being most significant in all the models was the percent black spruce around the nest. So this is really all becoming a relatively easy story to tell about how important this tree is for this species. And I don't know if Kara mentioned explicitly, I don't think, but like if you look at the range of black spruce in North America and you superimpose the range of boreal chickadee on top of that, it would be a pretty close match. And so we did see that days 0 to 18, so that dependent period survival was about 50%, which is, I don't know, that's maybe on par, maybe a little bit better than some other species. One thing that boreal chickadees can do or are able to do because they are cavity nesters is that they remain in the nest a lot longer than other birds of their size that use open cup nests or things like that. And so they're much more fully formed birds than some that, have to fledge 7 days, 8 days after they are hatched. Boreal chickadees can stay in their nest box 15, 16, or even 17 days. So that's interesting. Okay, so in summary, like Kara said, we don't know a whole lot about the species, even though it's pretty widely distributed. We are learning a lot. And so we basically are, it was really fun to be able to describe, basic life history, natural history type stuff about this species for the first time. They don't split their broods, for example. When did they leave the care of their parents? They have some strict habitat requirements, so on and so forth. And I think you're getting a picture about the importance of black spruce for this species. And just to hammer it home, like Kara said, retaining black spruce is going to be super important for this species, especially stands that are old or old and stagnant in particular. It seems like they really like those particular stands, and those are, take an awful long time to become useful habitat for boreal chickadees. Avoid fragmentation, like Kara was talking about. And at all costs, avoid clear cutting. Clear cutting is not doing anything for any species of peatland bird, as we will talk about in just a minute. Another thing, because boreal chickadees are cavity nesters and they're secondary cavity nesters, so they're not a woodpecker, and so they're not drilling into a, live spruce. They're looking for either a stump maybe or a tipped over tree that's caused a crack, and they can sort of like bore in there when the rock gets in there, or they're just looking for a snag. So any retaining of that, or even just leaving stumps or like taller trees or whatever, even if you were to do a clear cut, if you could just leave some like higher stumps that would rot and then be available to them, that would be really useful. Okay, so that's the boreal chickadee story. Now we're going to change gears a little bit and talk about Connecticut warbler. One thing that's always amazing to me is Connecticut warblers and boreal chickadees can be, and often are, next door neighbors. Like you'll literally hear one while you're watching another one, or vice versa. And so they really do like similar habitats, not identical, but similar. But that's where the similarity ends. And there really are sort of, in my mind, two solutions to a problem of how to live in a forested peatland system. Boreal chickadees stick it out. They're there all the time. And Connecticut warblers go all the way to South America. So, you know, it's really an exciting duo to think about and their diverse needs. And like you heard about me and Josh and others talking about, Connecticut warblers are, by all accounts, at least in the southern part of the range, in dire straits from population perspective. And so we have been thinking about that for a long time because of the trends that we've been seeing with the Forest Bird Monitoring Project. And we were able to really sort of delve deeper. Okay, that's why I said, you know, trends aren't looking good at all. We need to do something. Also, remember from my talk earlier, we were talking about that the sort of the soft or hard edge. If you recall, we won't take a show of hands or anything like that, but hopefully you recall that this would be a classic example of a hard edge. And so there's a lot of abundance. You can see that red color in Connecticut warbler is really quite red at the southern edge of their range there. And so we do have this, in my mind, a responsibility to take care of this as much as we can, because we have a lot of birds that are using the Agassiz lowlands area up in north central Minnesota. Okay, so in contrast to boreal chickadees, Connecticut warblers like things a little bit less dense. And so they don't like super duper high canopy cover. They don't like it really open either, but so like that sort of like a little Goldilocks situation, they like it right in the middle. And you can see that in these two pictures. Unlike boreal chickadees, they also will use tamarack. And so they, that's nice. They, you know, so they're not strictly tied to black spruce, although as we've been talking about, tamarack is undergoing some serious issues of its own. So we looked at Connecticut warblers, and I think I've talked about this in past meetings with this group, and so I'm sort of breezing through this part of the Connecticut warbler project because we want to talk about the experimental harvest part of the project that is ongoing as we speak. But basically in 2020 or 2019 and 2020, we studied Connecticut warblers in the Saxon Bog close to home in Duluth here, and then in the Red Lake WMA. We found a bunch of nests, 11 nests, which doesn't sound like a lot until you realize that, you know, very few nests have ever been found of this species. And so similar to the boreal chickadee, or even more so, we were able to document and publish, as you see on the bottom there, really awesome natural history information about this species. And so here's just some results from that. We found those 11 nests. Like I said, the boreal chickadees get to have the luxury of living in a cavity for 15 or 16 days. Connecticut warblers don't have that at all. They leave the nest 7 or 8 days after they are an egg, which is pretty insane. And because of that, the next week or so, they don't fly at all. They really look like feathered cockroaches sort of scurrying around the bog floor. We did something similar to the boreal chickadees where we tracked the individual birds after they left the nest, and we documented mortality. As expected, it was high during that early period, and we tracked them for some of them for as much as 3 weeks. And perhaps not surprising was that they really liked areas with high stem density because, you know, they're sitting ducks, so to speak, out in the bog because they can't fly or get away in any way for quite a long time after they leave the nest. And so that, you know, the denser the cover, the better. And we also, you know, did something similar where we looked at the distance they moved from day to day. And if you recall from a boreal chickadee slide just a few minutes ago, the scale, the y-axis there is a lot smaller. So these birds don't go nearly as far, even later, you know, 3 weeks out. Remember, boreal chickadees at that point have left their parents and are going sometimes 1.5 kilometers willy-nilly all over the bog. Connecticut warblers don't do that. It turns out this is a really good thing because of all the things that we know or that we don't know about Connecticut warblers, there's one thing that we sort of know, and that is what singing male Connecticut warblers like habitat-wise. And so it's really nice to be able to report that, you know, because Connecticut warblers nest close to where the males sing, and because the fledglings don't go crazy far and they don't go into another habitat or anything like that, because we know what the singing male's like, we can use that as a proxy for what the nests that the females make and attend, and also the young birds use. So that's really good news. But like I said, that hasn't, we still have a problem because the Connecticut warbler populations are declining so rapidly. And so we know from some previous studies that Connecticut warblers are correlated, presence of Connecticut warblers is correlated with large tracts of black spruce and tamarack on the landscape. And in my mind, the reason for that is not because necessarily they need, acres and acres and acres of the stuff for their particular brood, but because all of that peatland forest isn't created alike. They need that certain structure. And so if you have a large patch of tamarack or black spruce, it's more likely to have that particular structure that they're looking for. Like Alexis talked about, the larch beetle is a major problem for Connecticut warblers. This is something that we certainly should be paying more attention to, and maybe trying to do something about. This may be one of the nails in the coffin of the Connecticut warbler in this part of the world, but it's not helping that a lot of their preferred habitat is being infested at a rapid rate. And similar recommendations for black spruce harvest for Connecticut warblers than boreal chickadees. And so this next part, we're going to transition into talking about the experimental harvests that you've been hearing Josh and Alexis and me talk about or allude to. And we just want to make it crystal clear right off the bat that we're not advocating for this to happen. What we're saying is leave it alone. If we can, don't harvest the black spruce at all. That's the best solution. But we are realists, at least in some way, and we recognize that harvest does have to happen. And if harvest does have to happen, can we do something other than clear cutting? Like I said, clear cutting is literally not doing anything for any of this unique peatland birds community, and it is destroying habitat and even potentially surrounding habitat for a long period of time. So currently clear cutting aerial seeding is the method that's being used, but we're suggesting some alternatives to that would retain 40 to 50% of the base area. Have a little wiggle room on that potentially, but some of the things that are listed here are things that we're thinking about. So we're thinking about wildlife, but we're thinking about natural regeneration. So we don't have to struggle to find black spruce cones. We don't have to use aerial seeding, which is expensive and costly and just wild in general. We're also thinking about the hydrology of the stands, like Alexis talked about. We're thinking about the connectivity of stands. Especially we're thinking about the heterogeneity of some of the stands, and hopefully that's what we're going to see after we have these alternative harvests and we see some results. So we don't have as even age stands in some of the areas. And, like boreal chickadees and other woodpeckers, we're thinking about tree cavities. So leaving trees or stumps or something like that so that birds can use them, both primary and secondary cavity users. And then finally, we are thinking about the economics, at least a little bit. Okay, so this is what we have: two alternative lowland conifer harvest that's set up. This is one of them. They're both on the Red Lake WMA. This is near Moose River Road. The other one is near the Hogsback Road. And so they're somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 to 120 acres. And we've divided that into 3 treatments. We also do have a control that's not being cut, and we have a clear cut that is being entirely cut. And so we have 3 different treatments that we're looking at. Group selection, so that would be on the left side of the stand here, where sort of looks like a string of pearls. So like circles taken out. All the edges for all of these different treatments will be feathered, so it's not a particularly hard edge. We're hoping that the group selection sort of mimics a more natural type disturbance. The bottom right is that shelter wood, so like real thin strip cuts. We were hoping to do more actual shelter wood, but it turned out that was a little bit difficult from an operations standpoint. And so that, that's what was going to happen on the bottom right there. And then top right is, sort of more traditional strip cutting. So 100-foot strips. And that's the easiest to pull off from an operations perspective, but also we suspect it's going to be the least preferred. We'll see. Okay, so, prior to having these sites cut, we did a whole lot of point counts. We have a number of years of point counts and all the treatments and the control. We set up some camera traps with buckets to survey small mammals as they were running around the forest. We also were able to survey amphibians and snakes in that way. And then we had some partners down in the cities and with the DNR do some pretty intense vegetation surveys in all these. So currently, one of the stands is being harvested, and another one hopefully will be harvested next year. And then, of course, we will go in afterwards and see what happened. A lot like, the hunter walking trail surveys that Reed was talking about, where we're going to have to monitor them long term to see, because, so it's not going to happen overnight, where, things change. And really, the goal of this is Connecticut warblers are in big time trouble. They like that medium structure in the stands. And so the hope is that we can retain a full suite of peatland forest birds and mammals and vegetation, but also then create some additional habitat within those stands for Connecticut warblers, because they like that. The sort of like, they're going to like we hope they're going to like the edges and the shelter wood and stuff like that we're creating for them. Okay, so this is hot off the presses. This was emailed to Josh and myself yesterday, I think it was. This is happening as we speak. This is on that Hogsback site, so sort of the east side of the Red Lake WMA. This is the 100-foot wide strip cut, so, that's what that looks like. This is taken from the side of one of those group selections, so that circle that's in the string of pearls. So that looks pretty good, I think, and it will look pretty good, especially once stuff starts regenerating in the middle. And then this is those narrow strips, and so I think that also looks pretty nice. And hoping that this isn't going to disturb our boreal chickadees too much, while also creating some excellent and awesome habitat for Connecticut warblers. Okay, so just to run down the conclusions of all that. I know that was kind of a whirlwind and fast, but hopefully I didn't lose anybody or miss anything too vital. But just to drive home one more time, the data that we collect from the Forest Bird Monitoring Project is vital for us to understand, and has been vital for us to understand the plight of the Connecticut warbler. You can't look at those population trend figures and think anything other than, oh, that doesn't look good and we should, do something about that. And so we were able to learn a whole lot more about them. Josh and others way back before I started in the lab had already been poking around with Connecticut warblers, and so we've just been adding to that foundation of knowledge. Really provided some excellent information about their breeding ecology and post-fledgling period of time for us, but also for, range-wide. This is what these birds do for the first time. And then also looking at these experimental harvests. I also should say that this has our interest in Connecticut warblers and research that has been possible because of our foundation from building these trends and whatnot, has helped us to lead the formation of the International Connecticut Warbler Working Group. So that's been exciting. So we've got a whole bunch of colleagues from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota in the United States, and then all the provinces of Canada in which the species breeds. And so we're really thinking holistically, at least from a breeding grounds perspective, on what's happening with Connecticut warblers. And then we are also starting to engage with other people in areas that they migrate through, and also where they spend the non-breeding season. And so in summary, Connecticut warblers need our help. We learned that, and we're sounding the alarm as best we can. So I think that is the end, and I'm happy to discuss or answer questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. So yeah, both what we learned, I think was kind of surprising. It seems simple when we say it out loud, but these species are like habitat specialists, but then they're specialists within the habitat, right? So it's like, it's really, we learned a lot about how adequate our forest management techniques that we've been using and for both species, and the answer is probably not adequate enough if we want to retain them in the long term. So does anybody have any questions for Steve or Kara?
I got a quick question. So, I was wondering, I didn't see, at least I might have, I could have missed it, I suppose, but I didn't hear or see anything about black spruce patch size. I know you said the bigger the better, but, or at least for the Connecticut warbler. But, you know, just specifically in my district, I had, while you were giving your presentation, I was really interested. So I pulled up, you know, what our average patch size for black spruce is, and the mean is only 14 acres. So I'm kind of curious, you know, when it comes to these management practices, it's really tough to do some of that, or at least make it economical to have them go in and do, you know, group selections or strip cuts or anything in a small patch size like that. And it lends itself to be more of a clear cut option. So I guess, you know, I don't know, well, how big, you know, what did you guys look at patch size, or is that just not part of the study?
Oh, we haven't, you know, looked at it per se, I guess. That hasn't been the focus. But I think, you know, something like, yeah, I think probably any size patch, if you do that, it's going to be better than clear cutting for sure. But I do understand what you're saying is that it would be a hard ask, especially from like a, you know, economic standpoint to, you know, to have somebody go in there, just wouldn't be enough in the stand to extract, you know, to make any, you know, profit, I guess. Alexis, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think when we look at occupancy of both Connecticut warblers and boreal chickadees in the national forests, they tend to only be in those bigger chunks of black spruce. And so even if the stand is like 15 acres, if like there's more black spruce nearby or like as part of the landscape, they might be using it. But you know how sometimes there's just a little chunk of black spruce and it's surrounded by aspen, they're not using those. And I think that's true for both those specialist species. So I think maybe context matter, like how isolated is it? And if it's very isolated, they're probably not using it anyway. But if it is part of a larger landscape, then, and it's certainly like maybe even the center of like a larger landscape, then it could be potentially important, even if it's relatively small, because those Connecticut's will kind of like pop in anywhere there's that structure available, even if it's not like a big stand itself. It's more like, hey, we found it here and this is where I want to be. And so from our point of view, it could be small, but as long as there's like, I think it was in like a kilometer, there's a certain proportion up to like 60 to 70% of both upland and lowland conifer, they'll tend to use it. That's helpful.
I think like one thing too is that Connecticut warblers and boreal chickadees would be pretty unlikely to be using something that small. Certainly, you know, more than a pair would be interesting. But like there are other species that are peatland specialists that will do that. Like in my mind, the one that sticks out immediately is yellow-bellied flycatcher. That species, it can use like really, really small pockets of black spruce. In some areas we work, it's like they'll be so small. It's like I don't even know how it found this particular stand of, you know, like 30 black spruce trees, and it's just a little swale or whatever. And so like, you know, I think those areas could be really important for species that don't need that like larger landscape, or maybe like that are able to expand into like more upland habitats or like non-black spruce like areas after they breed.
Hey, Reed, just a few things I'll point out with what we've learned. We had a backup plan, so if this was not gonna sell, we were gonna go to our DNR partners. We're gonna look at CPL funds to help, and more, more or less is gonna be more of a habitat project instead of a log, more of a logging based project. So I don't know if that could be a potential resource to you, is to look to those CPL funds or things like that. The other thing that we were looking at to do is maybe pair it with another harvest nearby. Maybe there's an aspen cut being implemented, and that would generate enough interest to get them in there to do it. So those are just some things that we considered along the way here. I will note that Hogsback site, there was considerably less black spruce in that site than what we had thought. There was a lot more mixed species in there, but they still ended up bidding on it. Ended up not selling at the auction, but they bought it over the counter there. So, they do have to have a certain number of cords, but I think there's ways to be creative about getting the harvest done as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks for adding that piece, Josh. Yeah, I think it's important to note that it was actually, purchased by a logger, and it wasn't just, something that we paid somebody to do or anything like that.
Sure. And, to be 100% transparent, at least as far as my question, I mean, it's very possible that a lot of these patches of black spruce, I just did a quick desk exercise. I'm not looking at the feasibility to even access some of this stuff. I mean, it might stay that way. It might not even be in silviculture's best interest to even try to access it. So, there's a lot of other factors that go into it, but I was just kind of curious on patch size and as I grow in my position and look at are involved in a lot more of these teams that look over areas, what should I really be prioritizing when it comes to these lowland conifer areas?
Yeah, I think, if you can prioritize like anything that you got that's really big or connected with other larger areas, like that's #1 priority in my mind.
Thanks for the info. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, in the interest of time, I wanted to, it is 12. And so if you need to jump off, don't feel rude if you need to, I guess. Because this is what I had on the calendar. But I also had the black ash talk on the agenda, and I could whiz through that really quickly if people wanted to stick around. Alternatively, I could just record it as a separate link and send it out and I could do both of those things too. Does anybody have any thoughts or interest in hearing about the black ash stuff? Okay, a couple people can stay on, so I'll go ahead. Again, if you need to jump off, I totally understand. I appreciate you guys joining us. Thanks, Sharon. I'm going to actually stop recording and then I'll restart it. And so you can watch this sort of as a unique video if anybody's interested in it. So Sharon, I'll talk to you soon.